Hello everyone, today we talk about the traditional transcendental ideology and the meaning of fear, right? And the so-called way of the left hand, the via regia, devourer of time, right? And more. That is to be understood in a broader sense, but not quite the usual one, at least in today's culture, as the Dionysian. Um, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a work titled The Birth of Tragedy, which he defines the concepts of Apollonian and Dionysian with a bias towards the latter that he will actually correct in his, say, historical, philosophical, religious interpretation in another work known as Ecce Homo. That, in fact, in such a definition, have little correspondence with the meaning that such entities had in antiquity. So before in fact, the late antique syncope of tradition and our relation with the sacred was fundamentally carried out, right? The advent of Christianity, in a sense, is the consequence of this, right? Christianity per se did not actually break the spell, right? This simply was destroyed by man in his aging, and Christendom, and actually especially Catholicism, as it was born at the time, was a gigantic effort to keep things together in the process. But we will talk about this also on another occasion, because I've been asked, by the way, to comment on essentially the Renaissance, kind of the early modern revival of the kind, especially with the Apollonian, and therefore this kind of ideal that humanists were in love with, that was something deeply, but I mean deeply, radically different from what, in fact, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, by the way, that, as we have learned already in this kind of videos, the ones in the Indo-European history playlist talk extensively about these things, were intended as one, in fact, and were eventually just seen as two hypotheses of themselves, as some kind of, in fact, masks of tragedy. In fact, that's why Nietzsche actually talks about them in those terms, because when the Hellenic tragedy was outlined, already great part of that kind of sacro mechanism and understanding was fundamentally lost and just kind of echoed, remembered, but already haven't taken the forms that of a civilization that was more the result of the fall, right? As it generally is. That doesn't mean that it's a negative thing, and many people still today think that being a traditionalist means to reject modernity in toto, but this is absolutely wrong, exactly because that broader relation between the light and the darkness is fundamentally misunderstood, just as either, I will take one of the two and I will go for it, and just a selfish need, of wishful thinking, as we will learn in this video. And this is true especially in an esoteric understanding of those realities. That was the only way effectively to access them and to be initiated to, which unfortunately also have been understood in a kind of gnostic sense today, rather than in a purely intellectualistic way, and not in a action sense, but more, right, in the broader capacity of transcending our own limitations, because we also fundamentally lack there's an absolute intellectual component to this, but not an intellectualistic one, right? That is based on the acknowledgement of the role of the truth, and therefore what this, how this should affect at least our world, and doesn't, because we're fundamentally blinded by our own ignorance. And this is incidentally so difficult to understand just because we had absolutely appreciable texts such as Bernd Bockung, the Frage, was ist Aufklärung by Kant, that told people to say, okay, well, yes, now I know because I'm not brainwashed. And incidentally, today, it happens very clearly to see that the more people think that and use that phraseology, that rhetoric, that dialectic, they are exactly the most brainwashable one, right? All people essentially buying in, even if it were only for the emotional state that conspiracy theory entails, right? You understand that you have been completely lost to the Dionysian. You're a superstitious, ignorant, incapable, weak, and cowardly individual that essentially refuses to make any effort to try to understand the actual truth and the only truth by simply essentially using a skepticistic attitude towards the establishment for what it is that should be ruled in turn and not feared paranoidly. And the ultimate end of these people, as always, unfortunately, in history, is that the fourth estate is brought under, and better people can and have the sacred right to rule on their skins. And fortunately, again, it's exactly what is happening today, because in that regard, everybody's well responsible for their own fate, and what is happening is, fortunately, the sinking of the masses. That is not unspeakable, and that's why also modernity is misunderstood in a way, but it's deserved by them. So in that logic, there is really nothing wrong per se, and that's the also acknowledgement of the order thing for what it is, including our own fall, that we'll try to observe better now. So in this video, I mentioned Nietzsche because his assumptions about the Apollonian and the Dionysian in, again, the birth of tragedy, because eventually Nietzsche revisits that concept, modifies it, and so on, as a starting point for orienting ourselves in these fundamental existential orientations. Because in the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche basically again hypothesizes the two concepts, and he points out that the function of civilization is not, say, has should be Apollonian fundamentally, but it has failed, right, because of the nature of man, etc. And the Dionysian per se is not to be understood as the evil in absolute terms, but actually a distracting force that can help essentially destroying civilization to rebuild it, right? And that's why, for example, a lot of what was taken from this interpretation by some also ideologists and even politicians and so on, it was that the great baths of blood and destruction of the First and the Second World War were somehow the chance to create a new, healthier society. And this was the premise, actually, of the same totalitarianism. I mean, just think about, the idea of total war. That was also kind of fundamentally, radically and diametrically misunderstood from the Clausewitzian theory that actually talks about absolute war and exactly to define the reality of mankind that cannot, right, carry out anything even close to absolute war, right? And so that was weaponized by the Nazis in a way, but also by lots of other people for that matter. And Nietzsche's mistake in that is essentially, again, hypothesizing the two concepts and not realizing that, and so opposing them diametrically, as if there were no compatibility in a broader sense between the two. And that instead is against the ancient, against tradition, as we call it in a universal sense, that, as we've seen very often in all the videos about Indo-European religion, but not only, but also the one on ancient warfare, the sacred war bands, heroic transfiguration, and all these things, we know are complementary with one another. Perhaps the best video you can watch regarding that is the Indo-European doctrine of self-sacrifice possessing the female demon of victory. That's exactly the point that you have to understand there, that fundamentally you cannot, according to tradition, achieve divine transfiguration without having come close to self-destruction, or having dared fundamentally stepping to it, but managing with all your forces from the other side to tame it, and thus to use the same furies, that is the Valkyries, the Erinyes, the deities of death that are going to torn yourself apart in this, in fact, way of the left hand. If you are not too strong to not just actually tame them, but to transfigure themselves, and thus transforming that demonic female dark beast into the splendid, beautiful, celestial glory that is nothing but your guardian angel, and thus, as such, not really what we've thought the guardian angel is, but some kind of alter ego of us that is the, if you want, the somatic, in fact, the material that has to be transfigured at some point and to incarnate the same glory, the same Holy Ghost that coming from, say, blessing itself through this individual transfiguration to your personal deeds, will bring you back through the same glory that had descended on you to heavens, to sit next to the gods, and to actually come back to the one. Because as we will see, the same concept of the gods in plural is incorrect, right? There is never been gods in the way we intend them, in a sort of in what we have literally fabricated, as if there ever was anything called properly polytheistic, and not just the degradation because of the fall, and thus the fall of the same divine race in a sort of an monotheistic sense from the truth, like a bit like Plotinus said, Neoplatonism, in which eventually everything has to come back to the one, to the unit, to the absolute, to the truth, to God, as a matter of fact. So this video, as we will see now, entails that also our, say, so-called tangible reality, in many ways, is the product of a human, or at that point still a divine, or even beyond divine, because that's, again, what is that is possible to achieve, right? What kind of God had we thought of in a kind of standardized, approximate, conventional way? But anyhow, of a human denial of pure will, and the creeping in of a fear that would have essentially bent the cosmic order and produce reality fundamentally as we know it, in its time and space limitation, right? And that tradition basically seeks to instead transcend by recompacting the unity that depends on the individual in that regard. It's not passively leave, right? Either this is the entire point of salvation, also in tradition. I made a video recently because I was asked that about how it works. What about grace, right? Is it just received by the gods? Are we blessed for something that is, just God decides, or is our deeds, or a mix of both? The point is that all these things overlap, right? If you are not perfect in this sense, according to tradition, and you don't even dare, of course, to come cross that limit, you cannot even properly achieve any salvation, and thus your fall and thus your mortality will make you wane away, dramatically enough into nothingness, and thus leaving your potential unfulfilled, unexploited. And this is the entire point of the original the traditional view, and why the concept also, just think about how we have conceived heaven and hell, right? Just, it does sound like a story, right, as fairy tale, because objectively the original concept was not the same. The original concept is much more frightening than it sounds, because it's, in a way, you have to go through hell anyway in your existence in order to achieve salvation, and was willing to do that. And we mean literal hell, not just, a bit of suffering in life. And as we will see, that can even be a huge tragedy altogether, as we witness every day in this valley of tears. So it's a much bigger game than we've used to believe, that again transcends, in fact, most of our moral scientific convention, right? We can think to be more or less aware in a sense, but essentially all we have, say, apparently created, experienced, discovered, etc., is just but a meager, trace of the much bigger world, in which we have absolutely no idea, and that as fools we are saying, oh, we accomplished so much. We hardly did, right? And if we did by a scale that is still evidently doomed, and that has essentially given up any other effort to just putting patches on things, just trying to delay the unavoidable, and essentially not concentrating on the solution that should be at the root of the entire endeavor. I will not digress on how these concepts, of course, today are barely accessible by anyone. Like, I personally don't know anyone living, or at least personally, that that I'm concretely aware of the knowledge of such things, for even presuming that as collectively we have any chance. But this does affect the collective side of the story as well, because this has to do, after all, with the universe. So it's not a subjective issue, right? Because the transfigurational value, as you know, is something that eventually would have such a radical moral and scientific impact in the world that even if it were just for Christian tradition, as you understand, still living after millennia because of that accomplishment, well, you could understand what this would mean if we, surpassed the idea that there is a limit about which we can't do anything. And most of the saying Christianity actually, Christianity was born with the idea that this was technically possible, at least imitationally, still through a medium. And again, this medium, of course, is God, and it cannot be taken out of the equation. But it's the same thing that we discussed in the video about grace, right? So you can look at that for kind of better explanation, because there I address also Christianity. But in this sense, I'm talking about Christianity as, the church in general. I mean, and the people thus. And so Christians in general, how much, the awareness of this, of the broader meaning of Christianity that was still alive, by the way, also in the following centuries of the common era. I mean, as we will see, the patristics was perfectly aware of that. I mean, the same saints that whose work we read, etc., we're perfectly aware that the entire thing was about that. And find me today any Christian who actually even cares about this, or anybody else for that matter. I know that some of you are interested in this topic, so this is very fascinating, because it does show that there is, and there is indeed, in other words, this is not kind of mysterious material. There are books to read. We have studied this thing. It's just the broader awareness about it is lower than the most obscure things that you can imagine in our current culture, subculture, as we have right at this point, as a broader expressional quality. But that reference to Nietzsche is important, because today we will refer essentially to his ideas of Apollonian and Dionysian, not the ones to eventually, digress on the explanation of the latter better, and of course in constant comparison with the Apollonian as well. But in explaining essentially what the broader point of and role of the Dionysian is in relation to that salvation, which is embodied by by Apollo and by the entire gospel as such that was present in the universal tradition since ever, because this is what men after the fall had been looking for, and the entire mythologies of the world revolved around um, the salvation and the savior as well, because humanity had already fallen. But again, what was the distance between God and humanity, and what is still today, right? So what's the role of this, and how much this conception is being anthropologized, let's say, and how much it's been just the same religion has been fundamentally modernized and secularized throughout the millennia, um, for humans to access and losing the meaning actually of it in the process over time, um, to the point of non-recognition. Again, the average person today doesn't usually even suspect what religion actually is in general in the first place, what it's supposed to be in relation to our understanding of reality. Um, this is a product, again, it's mostly due to massification, because the masses were the first and most, in fact, ignorant and morally inferior element of the world, and thus we have fundamentally decided to give everyone this chance, which is part of actually the approach that we should have towards salvation, because every human does have that potential, but in general the shortcoming is so great that most of the culture in which we, or again, subculture that we think we live in today, is just a mass product of radical ignorance towards anything, historical, scientific, moral, cultural, and again, we tend to kind of split all these things as separate branches, but that's the first step of the mistake and of the evil and of the actual Dionysian taken kind of in absolute terms, which is of course the ultimate death in the first place. So Dionysian is just instrumental, as we've already seen, to be tamed and to be used as a tool, which is also the order of the world, of the hierarchy of values, of the difference between each and every human being compared to another in a qualitative sense. So we can talk about the myth par excellence, right? Because immersed in the brightness and fabulous innocence of Eden, man was blessed and immortal. That was the actual golden age, is the earthly paradise, right? And always remember that this was occurring in a at least this is very, we should open another parenthesis in another video because it's too big, but you know what, this is a state of myth, right? So the problem of spirit and matter is powerful here, and the entire Gnostic heresy in fact starts from this dimension and so on. So as we will see how to justify, for example, the existence of a physical body, right? We'll try to explain that because the Holy Fathers actually talks about it, or Origenus explains it concretely, and the problem was posed already and evidently at that time in that Christian tradition. In any case, according, still sticking to the myth, in man himself, the tree of life blossomed. Right. This is the point. Life as also absolute truth, and this unspoiled condition, right? The purity, the perfection, the absolute. Thus, this life was luminous, was splendid. There was nothing of our sorrows and of our pains. But, and that's the moment of the fall, and this must explain why, of course, the entire civilization is based on accountability and responsibility, on the most obvious realization that every single damn thing that happens to us is caused by us. It's not caused by some external thing, whichever it is. And it is as brutal as you can imagine, because even if you get a tumor, basically, this is meant to be the thing, and that tells you how absolute that is. And I know it sounds shocking and probably also outrageous and offensive, but this goes beyond the type of fault that say, you did something wrong, so you deserve to be sick. Now, this is actually so, but it can be understood only if one understands the scale of how fallen humanity is. Not because, say, in our system of values, you wish a tumor to just, somebody that did something that can be compared even in the scale of, sufferings and pain and cost, because all that has an actual price in our world. This is something that goes far beyond it. That's why also what we can't actually understand that, right? So, again, I don't share conventionally such belief. I wouldn't like to be terminally ill or to leave the pain that I've seen definitely also in my family, in other people or whatever. I'm pretty well aware, let's say, along our conventional patterns of what this actually means. But the point of this all is that wishing for it not to happen, as if this happened for some random thing that you cannot absolutize the existence of, is not going to avoid any of that. That is to say, it's not, let's hope that this thing will not happen to me. What will you do? Will you use little horns? Will be using scaramantic practices? Will you, be essentially turn yourself into a slave by posing yourself under a superstition? Because this is exactly what a great part of religion has become today. And religion was never supposed to be any of this. Because religion is just a word, and it doesn't actually mean complete, just, let's say, defines a special relation that was implied by the fallen man and the sacred, that is the one for which you are relinquished. In other words, you have a bond, you have a duty towards the absolute. And that's when you realize that you cannot say, well, let's assume I smoke cigarettes all my life, and then I get a lung cancer, and then I complain because I get one. Lung cancer happens even to people who have never smoked a cigarette in their lives. So there are tons of other factors that, of course, affect your body and your mortality, and how we are all simply just decaying at every instant, and yet we don't think about that, right? That's the actual problem. Is death avoidable? Nobody poses that question anymore, because we have mathematically marked a limit, right? Humans die either because there is a necrosis or a hypertrophy, right? In other words, either you wear yourself out to the point that physically you don't function anymore, or there is something within you that grows and kills, and destroys the mechanism. And that's basically as far as our scientific knowledge goes, right? And we stop there because mathematically we have determined that there is something called the infinite that basically equates to the limit of our knowledge. And while our mathematical language, our physical understanding, our scientific knowledge help us expanding dramatically, magnificently our power, and therefore making our life better, more luminous, etc. Still, as we were saying before, this is minimal in comparison of the fact, again, that we cannot apparently avoid things like that, because we realize that scientifically it would require such, especially physical capacities, because we have been used to think it mostly like in terms of it's just a material limit, right? And the spiritual side of the story is not as being refused, also because, but why in both cases? Because in order to fix that, we would have had to carry out such an enormous effort that by approximation we decide, at least understandably for our conventional reality, that is too much. And that in order just to achieve something like that, we would have, essentially, we don't even know exactly what we would have to do, exactly because that infinite is not known. So what tradition actually says is that you can at least always make a step further in that direction. And that, as I was saying before, because why I was saying that we do not have to reject modernity, because, for example, our scientific knowledge is crucial in this. Like the truth, the logos, the verbum literally means knowledge. Science is it's not just fully compatible with the traditional view, but is also helping generating that strength, true knowledge that we need to have in order to reach reality. And the sad point that many people do not really want to accept today, because we've also been fed the positivistic myth that everything will always go better, which is hardly, likely, just considering the various odds, even in a political, military, social sense regarding humanity, that essentially is opposed to what also physically speaking we already know through thermodynamics. That is to say that the world is dying, right? That if we stick to the material dimension, we are doomed anyway. This we already know. This is pure science. This is present in every single damn physics book. The point is there another way? One way say, well, you do not accept that simply, well, why don't you accept that simply this is our fate? The question is, so what are you even living for? And the normal answer would be, well, because after all, life is pleasant in so many ways. Yes, this is exactly the problem, actually, to me. That life is pleasant, but in which form? That it is pleasant, just like for one pleasant thing you have to go through naturally much worse things, but is there kind of a way to keep this up, right? To eventually sublimate and magnify that absolute splendor we are conventionally habituated to by simply, how we've been raised, how our culture, our existence, you can argue ever since the fall, right? We are in. Well, you can realize that it's just, again, putting patches on a situation that we don't even, on a problem that we're not even trying to solve, really, right? And again, tradition was univocally, in all parts of the globe, in every single religion, saying that the thing has to be carried out spiritually, and there must be a specific reason, which is already evident from what we have already said. And that was actually also very specific about how things are supposed to work. Again, in that video about grace, I explained these things better. That is to say, what is that you can accomplish through grace, right? And how does this happen? We'll partly discuss it today, but again, presenting this knowledge seems still as wishful thinking from the other side, not because objectively it doesn't sound crazy, or because we can actually experience it, but the reason why we seemingly at least can't is exactly that we have stopped giving a shot to the ultimate point of it all, which is instead, again, around which tradition also clearly attributing the very features of our fall to a transcendental mechanism that again requires not shortcuts, and actually suffering much more than you have done it and you can do in your entire life, and that this is also the entire point of the story, seems to actually make a lot of sense, because we know pretty well, as we will see now, that also you cannot quite accomplish anything if you don't make an effort. And making an effort costs, and it's tiring and it's exhausting, and generally speaking we are lazy because of that second principle of thermodynamics. We know why this is the case, and so we should be aware that this may be the entire point of it all, through actually a purely also scientific understanding, except our scientific understanding today has crossed out the moral dimension, because our science today is designed essentially on pure materialism, right? And it is not done in an ideological sense, fortunately, and that's why science saves herself in this regard, in the sense that you're not told how to be a Marxist parasite on a physics book. Incidentally, many people in the, at least in some parts of the world, academy and so on, regarding exactly this so-called art sciences, are explicably in this sense leftistic oriented, but in sometimes towards literally radical communism. And there is a very specific historical explanation for this that actually doesn't fit at all the actual the great accomplishment that that science achieved per se, but rather speaks of the that end. That is to say, we may be discovering so many other things in this regard, but the point is that we have, in a sense, stopped thinking that that's the just the discovery of the instrument that we should, or a tool that we should use in order to carry out actions that, in fact, science does not prescribe, because science is not prescriptive, it's just descriptive. And so, morally speaking, what is the point of it all? Right? And these questions are not rhetoric, right? They would sound so if of course, also if you acknowledge exactly human limits in a purely materialistic sense. But the question is, have we ever tried to test the other side? Because we test it daily. Say, spirit, morality, ideas are not actually second to matter in our lives. Because to us, matter is vital, but at the same time, matter is not alive. We are the only ones that have only life has an awareness of herself, and humanity in this regard is the closest to that absolute knowledge that science helps us to pursue it in this, in fact, materially desolated world, right? And fortunately, this world is also habitated by other biological beings, and so we are not alone in this endeavor, but we should also point out what our role should be in all this, if anything, because we do seem to have developed in absolute terms the most complex. However this happened, right? Traditionalists would have a very specific idea of how this happened, right, compared to the other beings, right? And that's where also scientific theories have been difficult to digest in a world that was not really morally pure at all, right? For example, evolutionism, as you know, has been bitterly criticized and hated and literally despised and so on. But why, right? It actually describes what we can simply and empirically demonstrate. A person who doesn't understand that, or a person who thinks that the earth is flat or whatever, is not a skill a skillfully skeptical bright mind. It's just an inbred moron without any first world primary education and dignified average human intelligence. The point is that what we should revise seriously is how we have been posing ourselves towards this tool that we have exchanged for the end of the story. It's a bit the same mistake that we make when we look at war and we refuse to understand that it's, in fact, an instrument of politics. And we just demonize that, and in that process we completely take out of the way the equation of, for example, whether it's right or wrong to fight a specific war, which is also the reason why, as you know, we have talked about Ukraine often. How can basically pacifists today have become the new pro-Putin side, right? That's the level of course, of cultural inferiority and proper absolute lack of any, again, first world primary education level, and because we have allowed the fourth estate, the masses, to exist in the first place, to be unhinged when it was evident that the masses were too inferior to actually be allowed to do anything compared to what was before. But we can't whine about that either, and this is what traditionalism says, because the elite, so the aristocracy, so the one that would have, by their own merit, had won that control that was based on consensus, and so actually ruling the fourth estate, the Dionysian, from an Apollonian direction, became too weak, actually, and fell short of its own role and expectation. You see, this is a deeply counterintuitive theory that I'm tracing here, and that's why you will not hear it today. Today you just see the horizontal division. You don't see the vertical one anymore. And that's why it's all pointless. Like our entire approach, even to science, to anything good that to anything we can make good use of, is basically worthless. I mean, objectively, yes. What's the point even of the average Z generation person in say Admore? Okay, let's not be too discriminatory. Let's live just a generation as a discriminant here. To learn physics or history or anything else, considering that what it means to learn today is basically insignificant. That is to say, there is no standards, there is no discipline, there is no criticism, there is no capacity to apply that knowledge positively to modify reality. This is the bigger problem that we all have. It's not how much you pay for gas or whatever. That's just bullshit. First of all, you can afford to pay that. People who built our civilization, look into the problems that we currently have, would spit us in our face because if we complain, because we say, but do you even know what but even your parents, like what your grandparents were habituated to live with, and you pretend that the world is collapsing because you have to pay more gas. But have you ever opened a history book? And I'm not talking about, the worst disasters in the history of mankind. I'm just talking about the average, how the average person has always and regularly lived, being essentially content with that overall, compared to what we actually live like in the 21st century. And pretending these are actual problems. Aren't you disgusted by the fact that you even exist? I mean, honestly, to think something like that. Well, this is what tradition actually tells you. And it tells you as a massive slap on anybody's face, because who does care about this kind of reality? I mean, how fallen and inferior do you have to be to root for materialism? For rooting in a world where you deny the value of the spirit and of its force? What's the point of even living? Literally, what's the point of even existing? That's what you do not have the courage of answering, because you're a coward. And this is what, again, the entire tradition stressed, and that's why the Dionysian, actually, as we see it today, which is a bit like the same mistaken way in which Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy thought like, and then he said, well, whoops, I'm wrong, except today nobody will even understand what this all is really about, is actually useful to prove how wrong the entire reality that we have built as an illusion really is. And in this sense, it's crucial to go back to the fall, because what did really happen? Because essentially what the founding myth of mankind says is that in the golden age, at some point, this age of myth, man or God, because that's again what also different traditions slightly differ about. It's just actually a trick. It's not that they actually differ, but the narratives are different in the myths, right? And there are important, in fact, differences that this makes in turn. But man was seized essentially by this need, the will of a dominion over life, the overcoming of being, for the power of being and not being, having the damnation or the divine or super divine, for again how we think erroneously of gods today, and that's why Nietzsche made the mistake in defining the Apollonian and the Dionysian the way he did, of deciding between the yes and the no, between existence and not existence. This is the actual power that we have, that has a burden and it cannot be wielded otherwise. It's actually a huge privilege, the fact that we can decide, and we reject completely all what derives from this decision, no power, and have such an approximately superficial and ignorant view of reality. And the tree of good and evil in itself and in mankind can refer exactly to this, right? In the name of it, man detached himself from the tree of life itself, because he could decide, right? And it could decide because this always implies a moral choice, as we will see now. And naturally, deciding to detach himself from the tree of life, having this power on your own life, entailed the collapse of a whole world, right, in the flashing of a value that discloses the kingdom of he who, according to Hermetic saying, is superior to the gods themselves in virtue of that decisional capacity, immortal nature to which the gods are restricted. This is particularly important, while man is not. So who are the gods, by the way? Because again, we're talking about the gods as we know them also after the fall of man. And so the universe bent, and was not man actually equal to the gods? And the gods that we are, and God, actually the absolute power, doesn't entail that as well, right? So the gods that we are actually seeing in the so-called polytheistic pantheon, that again, historically from a religious point of view, literally never existed in the history of mankind. It's just an invention of modern secularistic times. It literally never existed in concept, but that were, let's say, still again a manifestation of that universal order incarnation in a way, right? This is particularly evident in, also in comparing the Europeistics, where more primitive people still had the realization that there were less forces, were kind of even anthropomorphizing, and thus, yes, distinguishing lacking actually a valid reason for this distinction, if not a fault, a guilt, right? The same reason why man was inferior to them, to the gods. This still figured as some sort of partners in the broader scene. And how mortal or immortal they were, because they are generated. There are other factors that go beyond. I made a video about Caesar's religion and the role of Fortuna, for example. Think about, I don't know, in the Germanic pantheon, there is also a part of that actually happening with different, emanations of Odin himself. You understand? This is the sun. Actually it's the same thing. It's the way the fallen kind has started to describe a specific aspect of the mechanism because it failed to understand the wall, and so had to, say, explain in cognitive ways that would be accessible also to others, but again, with a fault in that explanation. That's why also more advanced civilization needed to do this more, because it's difficult to make, again, the fallen kind realize things if you still, however, want to make him do anything. So, for example, the Romans had split Mars and the Führer from as a deity on their own from from Jupiter, whereas the concept initially made no sense, right? But we will talk about this in other. I made a video about, by the way, the Germanic Norse religion, about also the moral superiority of the Roman civilization, all these things you can go check. But the power of man in this regard is that he has also mortal nature in his power. And thus you understand, together with the infinite, also the finite. And this is what we were saying before. We have both. We are not living in a universe where you can say, well, I don't understand the infinite, so, it doesn't really matter. And who told you that you cannot understand it exactly? Right? How far did you test? Right? Which record is that you can never break? This is also mathematically a concept that does not make any sense, per se. And so we concentrated on the finite. And why so? We will see it now. So with the affirmation, we also have the negation. Thus, in the language of the Hermetic theories, is marked by the expression of man as, quote, the lord of the two natures, right? And the terrible power that derives from it. Because if you even just read the Bible, you understand what happens. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the earthly heaven. And they, of course, have to deal now with the power that they have acquired. And God lets them do. Right? First of all, the connection with God is never lost, because the absolute is always valid. But it's at that point that humanity, by the way, through a homicide, which is also the killing of your brother, emerges through essentially civilization. And God lets that happen without too much of a problem. This is also Prometheus. Prometheus myth condensates to two things, because it actually talks still about the fall of mankind. Let's say the fall of mankind has already happened. But the power of fire there is given, but is stolen essentially from the gods. You can argue that in the biblical myth and also in others instead, part of that knowledge was evidently intrinsic in the fallen kind, because the kind had fallen, but not completely or absolutely. And interestingly enough, as we will see, Origenes said, for example, this had entailed the fact that the fall had entailed the same creation of a physical world per se, but also of a bodily dimension of humans. That thus was a way to maintain to prevent from further falling, right? Further falling would have meant literal death, absolute death, pure matter, so no life of any form. And instead, man retained a soul. And that aforementioned power, by the way, which is a frighteningly powerful one, as much as, our nuclear one so far can be, but it's something that goes much more beyond in a non-conventional sense, is the incredible power of generating life, as much as taking it away. Do you realize how big that is? And how much our culture basically doesn't give a fuck about this. The fact that we can make children and we can kill people, and our world goes on like that. Do you realize what it even means? What is the potential of life, and why religion insists so much on it? I mean, it's beautiful, but it's terrifying at the same time. And that's why we want to deny this too. That's why antinatalism, that's why pacifism, because these are expressions of an inferior kind, of a terrified kind, not as a marbled one. It's the expression of the weak, of the culturally underdeveloped, of people that do not own power and are destined to go under because they will disappear. Have you ever thought that antinatalists are going to essentially self-destroy their own life? Because they're not going to perpetuate in any way. And they will even tell you that is, you want to make children just because you're selfish, you want to have a little you. How can you even have a respect towards these people? It's hard to tell. But in any case, so the contempt of life, we're not talking about abortion and more, but that's pure Luciferine. Feminism is it's Dionysianism. The Demeterism, Pythagoreanism. The Pythagorean theory there is also quite nasty. As you know, the guy was a crazy communist fanatic who had both the entirely in the Demetrian, Pelagian, Aphrodisian cults, and that was, in that sense, radically advocating just for a materialistic view of the world. So be aware also of the heroes you pick there, because you're not really talking about heroes of science. We're talking about Satan himself. In any case, because again, where is the problem there? That he was a scientist? No, the problem is that he was a scientist without morals, and that's the actual power of evil. Because you confer some materialistic power to damage, in fact, our physical dimension, to people that do not have morals, and so that do not know how to use that mean, but for merely destructive purposes. And that's the entire meaning of communism, of Marxism, of Dionysianism. It's the same exact thing. It reemerges. It's a universal thing. It was not invented at some point. It's always the same dichotomy in which we live every day. Because again, we all have that good and evil within us. And it's always up to us to make the difference. And that's what, again, traditionalism expresses beautifully. But so what was the real problem of this will? Because you see, up to this point, there was no actual sin. This was men wanting to have a further control, so stepping further and actually growing, apparently, over, deciding over the possibility of existing and not existing even. But this is, as we'll see, what exactly broke him. For his own fault, not for the thing in itself, but because he was not enough for it. Right? The man was literally not enough for this act. And this is what, in fact, the more prudential side of the story of messianism, of salvation, even of a sort of superstitious bias regarding who will save us, rather than how we will save us. And again, the confessional clashes in Europe have been fought literally over this problem, because Catholicism retained the possibility of having an influence through your deeds on your salvation. This is a radically important aspect of the story, because it held, even in that world that had already fallen, was falling further, and already from antiquity had degenerated itself for the weakness of man. It was saying, you can make the difference, so you should believe in that. And that's the Apollonian side of the story, as opposed to a sort of predestination for which, well, it's already decided, so what's the point of even living, or, posing myself any problem? That's, you understand, where Satan creeps in. Man was not enough for this control over his existence and non-existence at the same time, and the choice over it. So, terror seized him. Here's the Dionysian. He is the monstrous that takes over. There is an inclination. See this. This was not a world where the purity of it was exclusive Apollonian. This is the mistake that we make very often. Pure perfection and power is the full hierarchical integration of Apollonian over Dionysian. What happened at that point is that handling these forces, man was overrun by fear. Right? There is evidently, as you understand, something already entailing a sort of fall in the distancing from that absolute perfection of life. Because as we were saying before, the point doesn't seem really the problem of having a control on the decision of whether existing or not existing. The fact is toying too much with the idea that with the fear that at some point you may not exist. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what the problem really was. It was referred to that aspect, but that was probably known before. It's just that, as a perfect order, it should have not bothered anyone. So this is a broader metaphor for the aging of the world that reveals to us how, in fact, as in all traditional belief, there is a constant struggle to keep the two things balanced. Because we know that the matter will decay anyway, badly, and so in order to wear, I'll say, on the fact that this matter is somehow not in the literal physical way that we experience, because that's still a consequence of our fall, but in whatever this was meant to be, even as a result of that fear, this was still included in the perfection of it all, right? So this is beautiful because it tells you that the problem is born in the spirit, not in the matter, and that also the spirit has to be ever stronger. And that's probably why the myth explains the fact that at a point there was also a choice whether to extend his power further. But this should have been perfect and absolute in the first place. So this may be a trace still of the fact that we're trying to explain the thing from a fallen position, and so we needed to insert this in the myth, right? So what happened in this? There is a Kabbalistic text that uses a beautiful terminology to describe what happened. There was a lamp under too intense a brightness, right? Like a circuit struck by too high a potential. So the essences cracked. The perfect balance between Apollonian and Dionysian cracked. What in a sense, divided them more, right? So that it made it easy also for men to hypostasize them, as Nietzsche was doing in The Birth of Tragedy. So the meaning of the fall and of a fault and guilt itself must be related to this. So terror was unleashed. If you wonder why I'm making this video, aside from the fact that it's supposed to be the Halloween special, but I thought it was meaningful because great part of our shadows and our fears and our are exactly this, are exactly like looking at in the face of our worst nightmares is, according to tradition, the way to come out of the abyss. This is also what Nietzsche, after all, in other of his works, famously points out. And the you see the spiritual powers that were supposed to be servants. This is the point. They were meant to be under, because they were qualitatively inferior, and it was just there because our duty is to rule over them. Well, they immediately rushed and froze in the form of autonomous, fatal, objective existences. If you want creation intended in its material sense, I know that Genesis follows another order, but in that sense, again, this has been also in the Judean tradition, it's been criticized because it's that, the Jews were more influenced by some sort of kind of more chthonic dimension already. This is this may be true because, of course, every people underwent that decline in a sense, but in the Bible we see actually a positive idea of the Genesis. So what the broader sense of it all is that there is naturally a positive attitude towards God that has, in a sense, entrusted us with the means of ruling the earth for a positive purpose. That's why, as we were saying before, the world myth, also the one of the fall in the Bible, etc., is different from the one of Prometheus, for example. That is more, aristocratic, is more Indo-European, But actually, the traditions mean the same thing, and the Judean one can be hardly criticized, right? Because it does entail already some sort of greater acceptation of the fall per se. It is still a dramatic event in the in the scripture, but let's say has kind of a better attitude towards the material capacity of the world. Cain says to God, yes, I killed my brother, and okay, yeah, it feels like it's terrible, right? God doesn't even punish him for that reason. And so in that it is entailed, given that Cain goes eventually in the world and starts living in the city and learning crafts and so on. So that's the equivalent of Prometheus myth. So that passes through, in that sense, having killed your own brother and feeling terrible for it. And so the Jewish tradition kind of already acknowledges it in the sense that man is, it's a positive message because it shows that man is able to understand deeply that guilt by himself without God actually taking that terrible revenge that in a broader sense is entailed by the fact that we can wield weapons, that we can destroy each other, that we can destroy the world, which is true. But at least in the Hellenic myth, it's, and Prometheus is, in the Norse one you have Loki and this kind of thing. It's tortured and disemboweled and forever, quite graphically exposing the atrocious, terrible thing that it means for us to be able, say, to wage war, for example. But it's accepted, right, in the order of things, at least in the way we are a bit all fallen, right? Even in the Bible, after all, if you think about it, Adam and Eve as a God's creation, and even evil as conceived as this kind of terror, because it's a distrust towards God at the end of the day, and of course a disobedience towards him, is God's failure in some way. It's just like the deluge, and God decides that mankind is a mess and wipes it out. So in that sense, the absolute is also crippled, and that's again the same. At least it is crippled if we personalize that figure. So that's how we have personalized either God or the gods, right? Whereas the primigenial concept is much more absolute. This is very important, in my opinion, in a historically religious sense. Now, suffered, rendered external, and fleeting to itself, power, after the fall, took on the species of autonomous objective existence. That is to say, in the before the fall, there was no such thing even as reality as we understand it. Exactly. In the absolute way. Again, the myth says yes, it was earthly heaven. The earth was already created in the Jewish tradition. Yes, it is the case. But again, in the way we explained before, this is already blending what had happened in the atrocious sense from the primigenial fall. Even again, if the sequence chronological is different, that doesn't matter. The meaning is that one. And so that's also why you cannot read the Bible literally, because it must be interpreted according to the fact that it's just written by mortals, right? So the sacral value is intrinsic in the measure in which you actually understand why it was written, assessing the existence of the truth. As opposed to sclerotize in a fundamentalistic way, which is also what basically any religion at some point has done, but because of stupid mortals, that should be wiped out from the face of the earth, as we wipe out terrorists, etc. At least in a way that conflicts with that, in fact, complete lack of respect towards the sacred for what it is properly meant to be, in that infinite truth and perfection and absolute and power. So there was a vertiginous apex from which man began to fall, right? Because it was so high that it would give you some sort of vertiginous effect, which is in tradition pretty much clear, because the gods live above, right? Think about the Olympus. This is present also in the Vedic world. Think about the Asgard. These are all mountains, right? The capital and hill. The idea is that the better live above, right? So it's a way to come as close as possible to where we were before the fall. And all this height became, for a weakened man, it was his own height, and he's terrified by it. It's as if you fear to stand, and you had to lay down and think, oh my God, before I could stand up, now you're too lazy to get up again, right? So the same entirety became the indomitable contingency of phenomena among which man wanders, right? Trembling and as a miserable shadow of himself. This is what literally also the fall from the earthly paradise that was above ground. As you know, if you look also at the Divine Comedy, this awareness was there, right? This was an elevated area from which men dominated in a universal sense, at least at that point having taken some form of physicality as well, but from which, once he gets down, it seems to be dominated in a way that he cannot bear. And so he wanders across the earth by not being able to retake his own place. or a ruler. And the problem, as you understand, is himself, because all this was contained in perfection. And so mankind literally fell within a glass of water, and still is, right? And that's why this situation is so miserable and terrifying, but also ridiculous in itself, because it's as if we always had, and we still had, of course, the same force, but haven't stopped to learn how to use it. And in a way, it could even be said that this was the curse cast by the same slain God, so the slain absolute perfection, against the one who was unable to take his inheritance or remaining at his place. Because again, what did that perfection entail at the end of the day? Wasn't it all one? Before, is there a distinction again between God and mankind? It wasn't. That's what really tradition says. We are the divine race with various degrees of fall that also manifest physically. That's why beauty is a value in tradition. But it's not all, of course. And with Apollo, always understood in Nietzschean terms, so in this somewhat now kind of hypothesized just ideal rather than the reality of existence in a divine sense, derived from the development of such failure. Right? Think about in Hellenic art, the pursuit of these perfect forms. This would have been owned by humanity. Why do you need to make statues? To essentially long for something that you have lost. So that can influence the spirits by saying, be aware that perfection existed. That's what the beauty of Hellenic art really means in those forms. But we have just thought that this is just culture, it's just a style that these guys in this place did, and it's just like every culture is different, more or less. You have to accept diversity and all these things. It doesn't mean shit. If you do not get what the universal meaning and a hierarchical scale of values really mean, you are doing evil, and you're self-destroying yourself together with the people around you. Moral relativism means cultural inferiority, and there is no doubt in the fact that the most accomplished civilizations are definitely the superior ones. That civilization is not a denial of tradition, as the fourth estaters that cannot accept that their stinky masses are trying to make you understand today in an ethno-populistic sense. They are the inferior ones. Civilization is the superiority of beauty, of intelligence, of quality, of force, of elite, of power. That's what it is. And that's godlike. And it's tending towards God. Back to where we should belong, if it weren't for our apparently hopeless wickedness. And that's exactly the thing. So never wink at the masses if you care about your soul, because that's evil. That's the devil himself. It's the non-being. It's the non-existence. It's the dissolution into nothingness. And that's what, at the end of the day, our mortality is here to remind us. We don't live forever. We cannot always try to learn infinitely of how to fix our way back to divinity. We live just, if we are lucky, in the first world, like 80 years. Right? And I don't know about you, but yeah, I'm still in the first half, of course, but I haven't figured out exactly how to fix the way, especially in time. And nobody seems to care and to make an helpful effort, quite the contrary. So in in its elementary function, it must be referred to the will that discharges itself, right? In tradition, there is an absolute will, right? That being such is also translated in absolute action. So it's the pure perfection standing, in inner self, right? It's a bit the concept of absolute war in von Clausewitz. If there were something like absolute war, there would have been no war, because everything in the universe would go at its place, and everything would stand in the most perfect order, because everybody would know everything, so that nothing would need to be done. Everything would already be at its place. And that's the same concept, in fact, of unity in the universal tradition. So what reality actually substantiates in a physical sense is exactly the discharge of such will into some kind of, in fact, proper weakness. It's as if your mind had retained all this enormous power in a divine form, and then when you let it go, and so that you feel like every human does, stupid, and that cannot understand everything, that would like to get back all the knowledge and can't, would have discharged this by creating literally the physical world around. So as you understand, this is also a collective fault, and that's why the concept of a Holy Ghost also applies to the community of the church in the Christian tradition, and it is part of the imperial belief, right? There is no civilization without an imperial superiority. And so the faculty of ruling over the forces of evil, to discipline them, and to come back to that original perfection. If people are to be let themselves being ruled fundamentally, and not achieve the resurgence of the divine race itself, right? Back to the original status. So our duty is not also a merely individualistic one, a monadistic one, a subjectivistic one, a relativistic one. It is to say what I think matters as opposed to what the rest of the world doesn't. The only way you can hopefully save yourself is trying to encompass the entirety within you, and so to own it and to direct it back to the right, in the right way. And this implies, of course, an imperialistic vision, an imperial vision, at least, that is meant to retain control on the entirety, including people that in this sense are somewhat also, as we were saying before, like the multiplicity of the gods, just an illusion. Like we are all basically an emanation to something that should be one and only and perfect. And that's why, as we notice, like the superior kinds are less numerous, whereas the simplest ones are more. This is true in society. This is true in nature. The animal world. It's pretty self-evident. In order to be a predator, you have to have more load compared, at least, to the kind of prey that you want to attack. And so you must have some greater power. That can come through different ways, right? If you're a weasel, you can kill a rabbit that is 30 times heavier than you, but that's not actually the point. The point is that quality, that sharp quality. And in fact, in tradition, also the hero is hardly ever the simply huge guy. The giants, the titans, as you know, respectively, the Norse of the Hellenic tradition, are big, stupid people who do not have essentially the quality or the intelligence and the knowledge, in fact, the wisdom to prevail. Right? So the quality is everything to also determine a moral hierarchy of the beings. And in the fall, of course, man doesn't experience himself as will anymore, but it takes, it basically becomes passive. It creates an I, and a form, and thus vision, representation, and at least knowledge in the limited version that we experience. In other words, we started depending on the surrounding. We didn't act anymore, we just stopped watching what the hell is happening. This is like losing the initiative in strategy. So this is precisely the architect of the objective world, the transcendental foundation of the same category of space. Space understood as the way of being outside, right? As that for which things are no longer experienced as a function of will, but under the species of images and visivity, in the primordial objectification of fear that derived from the cracking and of the discharging of the will. Right? Transcendentally, the vision of a thing is the fear and the suffering of that thing. And this is evident also in evolution, meaning, what do we need eyes for? We need fundamentally to watch out whatever is happening around us. If we had other means to, or if we didn't have properly to care about the surrounding world, because we would dominate it, we wouldn't even need to rely on visibility per se. And this aspect is crucial because we live in a mass age dominated, for example, by the internet, that, in case you didn't notice, think about the meme generation. Is not essentially conceptualizing anymore. It's fundamentally just making you look at things, right? Conceptualizing should bring to that increasing quality, and that would give you ever greater power. Our world is ever more visually oriented. So to say, you don't need to think, you need just to see things around you and being like, oh, like that, and being amazed by it. And this is a concept that recurs in civilization. Just think about the Medusa, for example, that in the Hellenic myth literally petrified the adversaries, and that's why the ancient hoplites painted also her. And in the myth with Theseus, what he does, he uses essentially as a shield a mirror, and the Medusa watches as this Pelasgian goddess of chthonic material feministic evil in the mirror, and she freezes herself because, again, she's a chthonic monster. She doesn't belong to the, or at least she's a more fallen kind than the others, and she's dumb. Thus, instead the Indo-European Hellenic hero crushes her in that archetypal virility and so on, and crush the warrior that rules over these conquered peoples, and that visual dimension is as old as that point, right? People were complaining at the time about, I don't know, things like art, like frescoes, like the one you see in Knossos, where the Minotaur is and Theseus slays him, by the way, to that there is a deep meaning in there. Basically, the ultra cocky Indo-European hero arrives and kicks ass all over the Aegean, because that was conquered by the true conquerors that didn't give a damn about visual representation. It were just for superstitious people to watch like that and being parked in front of it and just being passive. It's just the myth of the cave in Plato, and that's exactly what I'm complaining about today. Again, I'm clickbaiting on YouTube, and the dumbing down of concepts, or essentially making people dumber. That's exactly what was perceived at the time. Again, for a true Roman, for example, literature was for effeminate people, because a true Roman had to be a warrior and focus all on will and on action, because a person who is that powerful is able simply to make things happen and doesn't need to just sit there and contemplate without actually trying to make a change. Especially in a world like that, in which change was also much more physically pressuring. And just think about what this means, because how deeply, in a much more physically oriented, physically active world, the spiritual dimension was exalted compared to our own, because of course they understood much more fully than us how deeply intertwined the divine superiority was in that original fusion between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, still in a hierarchical order, but in the sense that the two things, that the spirit had to rule over matter, and that would have been the perfection of the world. Today we depend on matter fundamentally. In communism, I made a video about this, the Soviet abomination of humanity, in which I explained what the Bolshevik theory essentially was focused on, that people had to work because machinery existed and their life was in function of it, rather than the other way around. If you wonder why communism spreads among the culturally underdeveloped, well, that's exactly the point. That again, just those who sunk the Hellenic myths perfectly knew what was happening also in this kind of more agrarian, feministic, Bronze Age, Pelasgian cultures that were brought under, in fact, so easily by the Indo-European conquerors, that literally thought that they came from the sky because they perfectly were connected with the divine idea there, and mutuated the same languages that we spoke today phonetically from the sound of the stars' movements, because those were the same gateway to heaven. Do you realize how important this is, and how further fallen our I don't even call it culture today. Today there's hardly any culture. I mean, let's be honest about it. There's no such thing like culture. But today we are experiencing, and how nobody cares. I mean, I'm convinced that most people today in the world, yes, say there are problems, but it's somebody else's fault, for example, because taking your own responsibility does not exist anymore, as is the entire point of this video. But the world is kind of fine. Yeah, as if living the way we do habitually is, we're satisfactory in general. Just thinking about how much we can do and how much we can actually do wouldn't be instead the purpose of everyone, right? We all do by some degree, but the level of expectation is so low that it's as if nobody really cared about improving. So the idea of the multiple, the idea that there is more than one, right? The indefinite divisibility, proper, for example, Pythagoreanism, or think about Democritus. This was highly attacked, in fact, also by the church in the Middle Ages. Think about Dante, think about Thomistics. The idea that everything was random after all, because the more you split, the more you complicate needlessly. Because you do it conceptually. This is exactly what is happening in the academy today with hyper-specialization. People, just know one thing. They literally have no idea of the whole, because they don't even think there is any point to do that. Just like, crazy prairie dogs that, run en masse into a suicidal dive in the great North American rivers. Like, it's just the crazy mass world where people have lost meaning even of themselves. And so the spatial form, in this regard, reconfirms its meaning. Look, for example, the beautiful geometric style in the archaic Hellenic art as compared to the Hellenistic one. There was a warrior decisionism
reflecting that in Hellenism it was just the masses under a ruler that was accomplishing the greater role, but ideally ruling just on a mass of fallen, ever more fallen kind. So again, as we were saying before, it's the people's fault if we get into feudalism, but it would be much better. So you should avoid it as a leader if you manage to take them over, but that's the point. But it would be much better if we all were a single kind and could come back, right, with an absolute act after this loss of tension and disintegration of the unity. And that's why the unity, the political cohesion, means everything too. Being politically divided means to be culturally underdeveloped as well, right? If there is one truth, what's the point of having and the truth exists independently from what people think, and this is the exact part. What's the value of having, say, 30 different ideas if you know that either 29 for sure and maybe all of 30 are wrong? There is a problem with that, right? The only reason why we accept this is that conventionally it seems that we cannot make things work better than this in a democratic sense, and it should work like that because again we at least keep the idea that every person can bring something valuable on the table. But again, if what is brought on the table at large is wrong, also what's its use on the longer run? The world keeps aging and falling, and everything seems rather masochistic by a certain degree. But just, you see, as the eye is not aware of itself, if not in function of what it sees, and that's how evolutionary our optic system really developed, right? Quite evidently. Likewise, being made external to itself by the Apollonian function of space is essentially dependent, linked, right? So Apollonian again in this unhinged way should be to the Dionysian. That is, it's a being that it rests, which draws its own consistency from another. In other words, you're not wanting something because of your knowledge, your perfection would immediately give you, but because you are depending on somebody else. And this attitude today is summed up, in my opinion, the way is saying, people who are confident are generally speaking the most stupid. Really? Do you really think so? Because I think that's a pretty big moral and scientific misassessment. Yes, you can be an idiot who just thinks, again, that the earth is flat. But if you are, you will go out there in the world and everybody will rightfully laugh at you, and you will have to confront yourself with that. So either improving or remaining miserable. And so in especially in the latter case, yes, that kind of confidence would be miserability. But what about instead the confidence of those who actually tell you that you're an idiot because you say something extremely stupid? And then, is that confidence in saying that the earth is not flat then some sort of weakness? Or isn't the confidence of an expert who knows the actual thing and that sometimes doesn't even have the time of, say, even by explaining it to others, is not understood because others cannot understand it, and thus he knows his deal, right? This is a bit like Plato's "Who will guard the guardians," right? The point is in his philosophy that that he makes, in fact, to answer that is, these are the best people. So in any case, we should, after all, entrust the thing to them. And so I think we also make a general confusion relatively to the idea, that give power to someone and it's worse. Well, first of all, yes, we're splitting power in theory equally and just on paper, by the way, by law, by civic right. But the concept is that, first of all, power rests also on the possibility, essentially on the capacity of it being based on the people, as we were saying before, in an imperial sense. So if your ideas do not work, either you have a very small empire or you don't have an empire at all. And secondly, that power is fueled exactly by the superiority of your thoughts. So, as I always say, every people deserves exactly the government that they get. It's useless for people to say, in my country, the left sucks. Well, if you're in your country, the left sucks, let's leave aside the fact left generally sucks more because it's the Dionysian. But let's say, if it sucks so badly in some cultural indicators, it's because the right sucks as well. Because your culture sucks. And not admitting that is the problem that you are causing personally is a form, again, of cultural inferiority, and it will bring you to fall even more below than you already are. And that's exactly what happens. We are in a historical phase where this is happening. It has already happened several times historically, and it, more or less the thing always repeats itself, at least in a theoretical pattern. Eventually, history never repeats itself, but that's also the point that people generally don't get. Like, let's say, so everything is different, so let's make moral relativism about everything. No, exactly because things are different, you should control them and rule over them and order them. We know that evolutionarily and neurocognitively, our nervous system developed to make sense of chaos. So people just sit there and paranoically and passive-aggressively and stand there and say, I don't want to change, I don't want to be judged, I want myself. They are the weaker ones. They belong, in fact, these are social and psychological issues of, generally speaking, countries that are less developed, especially the ones that underwent socialism, communism. We know that the individual has been despoiled of the idea that there is a standard, that things are different, that you cannot compare, that you cannot equate things, because everything is different. If you don't see the difference, how can you make any yourself? And that's exactly what's in peoples that were weaker, because they were just, generally speaking, less morally loaded and didn't accomplish much. The thing continues till to this day. And that's why disasters like the Russian one in Ukraine happen. And because they don't know how to do things. How do you think a people emerges after 70 years of communism? What do you think that it changes after 30 years? Because this is what fourth estaters in the West actually believe when they sympathize with it. They don't know anything about the history of that country. They don't know how to compare that, so they project on it whatever the hell they wish in their small brains it is, and completely deny reality, which is, in fact, exactly what who has no power, and that's why this always it's an alt-right thing. It's also an extreme left thing. It belongs to the fourth estate. It belongs to the lesser people, and we should stop feeling sympathies towards them. I'm absolutely for the deprivation of voting rights. For such. I mean, for people that again do not seem to have, and most adults in the world are this, and also in the same West that is the best, for that matter, do not have the educational standards, again, of a first world primary education. I'm speaking literally of high school, but it could be easily even middle school for most adults today. What's the point of them to vote, right? You give a license for people to drive a car. Why shouldn't you give them to vote? And the world would be much better ruled, because it would be devoid of the people who create the impasse, who replicate the fall and make chaos instead of creating unity. And this thing definitely, again, falls into a kind of feudal system, because in these times of crisis, eventually, the people always fell. The people, not just fortunately, never ruled anywhere in any place in the world historically, but they also, every time they made a revolution, they actually got under further. And this is exactly what is happening today, because they do not have strength on their own. qualitatively, individually speaking. So they can be instrumentalized as guinea pigs, as masses, just for having their rights deprived and remaining there. And this is happening in the right and in the left today, very eloquently, to the point that, as I've always explained very frequently, what we're talking about, actually right and left, is not even very correct, because they're essentially collectivistic people, right? Fascism, Nazism, communism, they all stem from socialism, and they are historically, like in the political theory, they spread exclusively from the mass theories that spread from socialism, from the 19th century, from the spread of the Industrial Revolution, because the masses, again, were unlocked in the process, in the political space. Also, again, because of the fall of the elite before the Ancien regime, but en masse, not individual. It's not that. Yes, the individuals also benefited from that, because generally speaking, the elite that still ruled them, the new elite, improved their quality somehow, so that there is hope for civilization to accomplish this. But altogether with a cost that has not been fixed, and that is inflating, and that in the lack of a sustained growth will erode the basis of civilization, as all traditions actually point out, starting from the Irminsul that is rotten at the roots by the snake, by the water, by the chthonic, in fact, the inferior element, the snake again, and the age of the wolf is gonna come close. But what is exactly, in fact, the Dionysian doing here? Because here, see, we were talking about the Apollonian and how we, after the fall, we decided to absolutize it and to oppose it to evil, without realizing that it's not just something you should individually tend to, but you should imperially command through over the Dionysian, that you do need. All the greatest powers and empires in the world were essentially an Apollonian elite elevating the chthonic mass, right? In an imperial sense, Rome is the greatest example in the history of mankind, right? It could have not been done if, the Romans had remained so elitistic at the end of the day, like in the Hellenistic world. They unlocked the masses themselves and used them to take over the world. And by reviving dramatically, by the way, the traditional idea all over the place, and making of Romanity the character of the universal empire so far in history, because all the other empires that emerged within the West, after Rome was still the greatest one, were all Roman in name and in symbols. Still today, by the way. Just today I was looking at NATO with a NATO flag with a little eagle on, right? Which I was pretty much flattered by. And however, and you have to deserve that symbol, by the way, not just trying to make weird mixes like other, post-communist states do, and you know what I'm referring to. But in any case, the need for this broader Apollonian ideal, right, generates this within itself the same category of the limit, which is in a way just, again, a sort of Dionysian corruption of the same. It's what we were saying about the Hellenic classical statues before, right? The tangibility and solidity of material things are their incorporation. Almost the very syncope of fear that stops being insufficient on the edge of the Dionysian world. And that's why today we talk exactly about that. You can argue that, in fact, that space, again, the physical reality, the material reality, is the fact of this fear, right? As much as space itself is the act of the fear itself, right? In other words, if we had remained in our divine status, we wouldn't witness reality as we do, right? You can see reality around you, and you can immediately perceive this idea that if there is an object, it's because you need it somehow. It's something that you depend on, that you want next to you, that you gather, that you crave in a sense, because you realize that you are limited, right? And that is the measure of your own limit. As a particular case of the limit, we have the law itself, right? As we were saying before, like we decided that we give this standard, and it can be useful in a theoretical sense about human rights and all. And it's also practical, because it does bring eventually a positive effect as well. But just because the condition favored the moment, right? This doesn't mean that it is that law, for example, is always respected, or you can't always have it respected. So I'm a big fan of the law in general, because I believe that knowledge, wisdom, and divine power manifest themselves through that necessity. So the law behaves as an imitation of it, because that's at the end of the day what also civilization owes, and where glory descends on the Holy Ghost. So again, that imperial power is manifested by the fact that you must give some standards to rule, but in a sense it's as if you were already saying, okay, now I'm out of here, but you do not do something wrong. That immediately means that that these people are potentially, they're not under your control. So law is a manifestation of this fear and this limitation as well. We just use it conventionally because, again, in this fallen world it works, but it shouldn't be like that, right? Which is also the reason why true freedom should be just God's, right? People who call for freedom as a value, first of all, they have some problem properly in the basics in their country's history, meaning that there is a term there is liberty, which means something other than freedom, and that is much more adequate to human civilization. But the stating that you need law to preserve freedom is kind of the declaration that there is no such thing, nor freedom nor law. Because if you need somebody to regulate it, what kind of positive freedom do you actually have? Positive freedom should be done to do things that work, right? So if you need to regulate people in order to achieve their freedom, it's because they're not evidently not free. And again, that's what liberty is supposed to be, and it's a positive thing, and that's how we rule the world and how create civilization and empires. But freedom is, in this sense, not even existing. It's not really a human condition. It can be annihilated, again, in this transcendental sense, but in the world, it is literally the manifestation of the failure, of the transcendence, that cannot work, right? So, on the contrary, what we are doing in the so-called social contract, I like more the term community because, social term is being abused somehow. The human transcendence fails, and with a horror of infinity, right? And so when, for example, alleged traditionalists talk about, look, before Christianity we were free, and the people arrived and imposed us the law and the regulation, everybody was pure and free. Yes, where? In the pagan world, where priests basically wouldn't make you take a single step because they were scared of you essentially gaining too much power individually within the community. This happened, I don't know, when they were the Vikings were colonizing Iceland. How do you think the system really worked, right? The deregulation in that sense was a limit of the actual people's freedom, and also especially of their actual capacities of accomplishment, right? In in many ways, in fact, that system was broken, by which, not by the Zippe, but by the Comitatus. Because it was those Vikings who went abroad, came back with riches, and they gathered strong retinues that literally unhinged the Scandinavian traditional system and created monarchies. They converted to Christianity and started actually a much more positive process than the one that existed before. And this is literally the ABC of medieval history, but somehow people who still engage in medievalism are pretty confused about the idea itself. So law, in this regard, you see, I made a video about Caesar's religion and the meaning of Fortuna there, that is mother and daughter of the gods, meaning to say that this entity that was deeply connected with war and with the same Holy Ghost, that is to say the Indo-European glory descending on in that case of the restorer of the broken order that the civil wars had made the Roman Golden Age seem, to be causing a second fall in some kind, because the Romans thought to be the chosen people who had restored the Golden Age, and that's what the entire ideology, in fact, of Caesar's religion also means in function of the Augustan propaganda, etc. Talks exactly of this, that Caesar acts beyond the law of the res publica, right? Because the law in there, so he basically steps next to the gods, because in fact Caesar is deified as well, because the law, so what the Senate was relying on, what had brought to disaster. It's a bit the same reason why under martial law, in conditions of emergency, certain civic rights are suspended, right? So naturally Caesar does this in a metaphysical sense, outside the res publica Romanorum herself. And this is the utter beauty of this belief. Because the law in that regard, you see, Romulus had founded Rome and dictated the sacred boundaries. He did that. There was not an hypothesis of law. There was just eventually Romulus transcends right into divinity as well. And so the law there, right, just like the right a bit, remains sclerotized, like in every culture, in every civilization, seeking through, it's with the community seeking through the same law to maintain hopelessly and falsely and evilly the constancy of the casual sequences, as if to say that you can't predict an order, a reality, just by, okay, we'll set this random formula and everything will go well. This is the positivistic and technologistic delusion that we live today, in which we think that just knowing something materialistic will save us, from our wretched state. This is not going to happen. It takes will, action, power, force, knowledge, not just relying on some algorithm and pretending that problems will be solved, because the world is too big to be calculated by something so trivially limited by a formula, right? And so it's as if civilization had been in search for a substitute for that divine certainty and possession from which it had fallen. And it's not going to happen. Right, it's not going to happen that you say, let's say that there is climate change, and which may even be, say, really a dangerous thing that we're undergoing. But let's stop pretending that we have even began to talk, and that there is anybody on this earth that can actually predict what is going to happen, or the degree by which humans can make a difference for better or for worse. This is pure superstition. It's an anti-scientific thought, and it has nothing to do with reality, nor with what will be needed to cope with any disaster, climatically included. Because nobody has made that effort. It's just wishful thinking. And in this sense, what we call positive science, and even any sort of dogmatic morality, could, in a way, fall in no different direction than this, because what does establish whether something is definitive or not? Right? I don't know, if you read the Gospels, you realize that the precepts are very much double thread, and there is a reason why that is. Because of course everything is always up to you. That the only way you have to save yourself is to do the right thing, and salvation would have to occur naturally. That there is always a medium in Christianity, but again, up to which point is this really a medium that externally intervenes just to, with nothing that you can do about that? Right? It was actually believed that you can do a lot about that. You cannot save yourself without God, because you need the truth. You need that sacred to make it. But that doesn't mean that you cannot approach that yourself. And so try to always do the right thing, and you will likely fail. And in theory, there is also a problem, because if you fail even once in your life, what's the possibility of redemption? Because nothing will kind of be the same anymore in a way. But this could still be a product of our own defeatism, rather than saying we could always kind of make it in the end, right? And in this sense, in fact, the third creature of the Nietzschean Apollo is finality, because for a god, it's a god, not God, right? So the kind of the polytheistic invention that we made up. The end cannot have any sense, since the god, a god, has nothing outside himself. That is to say, neither a good nor a true nor a rational or a pleasant or anything, right, from which to draw norms and be moved. On the contrary, good, true, rational, pleasant, and just, for example, identify with what simply he wants as much as he wants it, right? And again, this applies to only God in an absolute sense. Doesn't even need to do all this, because it's already present in the first place. So in philosophical terms, it can be said that of God's affirmation, it is the sufficient reason is the affirmation of himself. So you would even argue that there is a sort of nihilism in the way mankind should approach maybe the matter. Well, the point is that when you arrive to a divine status, that thing doesn't bother you anymore, because you have reaccomplished it. Like, we are spoiled by the idea that how beautiful it would be if I don't know, I won the lottery, if I had the perfect woman, if I don't know, if I had sometimes been, doing this before or not. And so you see how much we've wrestled with, our imperfection in many ways. But that's exactly the habit of thinking too much about, how really doomed we are, as opposed to actually concentrating on what we can do to actually save ourselves, at least intentionally, and how far would that lead us? Which actually in the human condition always exists as an idea. It's arguably all what moves us in a way or another, right? For the better, because again, we are not totally fallen. If we were totally fallen, we would simply not exist. It's just that we are so poisoned by this defeatism and and sufferance and all the worst things that can happen in our lives that we do not accept somehow the possibility that there is an ending point that is the absolute beginning, the absolute unspoiled reality, right? And so if we want to search for meanings, we have, we just have to go through the thing, because reaching the goal means to have fulfilled those meanings and not to have really been deprived of them. The reason why we think that, we say, oh, it's so boring if everything would be so perfect, is because we do not understand what perfect means. It's like the accomplishment of the accomplishments. On the other hand, beings external to themselves, in order to act, need a correlation. And that's what we do. A motive for action, or better said, a semblance of a motive for action. Just think about it. What is that motivates you every day? And how relevant and meaningful is that, right? How well thought and how, poignant is it, right? We do lots of things, like I do Schwerpunkt. Is it worth it? I don't know, I presume there is something in it, but it's obvious that it's not an absolute accomplishment of any sort, but I keep doing it somehow. And I did improve through it. I mean, the ways to God are really infinite, because they all lead only to, every way leads to God, right? The only difference that we can make is whether to go backwards or to go forward. But the universe revolves around the truth, so we cannot get lost if we work for it, right? But we often need a support, right, of something that we are always concerned by, because it's reasonable in conventional terms to say, okay, I cannot try to fly just by throwing myself of a building, because that would be a way to actually terminate my search much sooner than I think. But in this sense, when you look at the tradition in general about properly the meaning of faith, right? So that is actually a very strong form of determination, and that is the absolute one. The idea is that if you truly can despoil yourself of any fear, that is to say, not thinking, okay, now I don't have to have fear, because that means you're fearing yourself. But if you could reach the neurocognitive status of saying, I don't fear anything by any degree, divine transfiguration would happen, and you would be saved. Which is a big deal, because I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone who accomplished this, at least, in the non-mythological dimension. Now, whichever it is, can be even Jesus for that matter, but you understand what I mean. In fact, in the size of cases, outside of the trivial empirical contexts, man does not want something because he finds it, for example, right or rational per se, but finds it right and rational simply because he wants it to be. Psychoanalysis itself has given in this regard some valid contributions, and so what you understand that happens is that we twist reality into pretending that something that matters to us, and can be literally anything. That's why Nietzsche's work there is fundamental, because the will of power is beyond any other, right? It doesn't matter what you actually believe, but how, it does, of course, by the degree in which you can be wrong about its assumptions. And that's why searching for the truth is always crucial. But say you could believe anything, and still the most important thing is how much you're able to transcend your fears, and so how much you are able to actually find out what the truth is, as opposed to pretend what your truth is. And of course, people will think that there is their truth, will disappear into the bowels of hell much sooner than they think. Also because they will tend to have a much crappier life in everything than the others. And they will disappear. They will be devoured by the deities of the underworld. But at the same time, and that about hell, this is exactly what we're talking about today with all these beautiful pictures about death and more, is that going down to the depths where the will or impulse is nakedly affirmed, the man is afraid, right? Man doesn't want to accept to be in this condition, because the only reason why we are fallen is that we do not want to accept that we are. And what this specifically fully entails, right? For us today, we've been raised by being told, well, after all, you're born, you live for this amount, and there is kind of probably you think there is nothing after that. That's pretty much it. Just enjoy the ride. That's what we got down to. In the past, this idea was completely pointless from a literal point of view, because what does it actually bring, per se? I mean, why would at that point you not consider what is pushing you in life to do anything just as a meaning, right? Even if you believe, and that's what in fact we still own, because again, if we didn't, we would be dead in the first place immediately. That's why we don't carry out a massive suicide for that matter, because we do see that there is a point, right? It's that simple. It's not just why are you scared of dying, actually? Because you know that you have one shot, and this shot measures infinite, even if apparently it's finite, because in our material empiric world we decide that there is something like time or space. It doesn't mean that this should have any power on life. Thinking that is our fallen condition. And so, again, subordinating life to something like time and space that factually and scientifically do not exist. And this is a big issue, because none of our scientific language, for example, has any validity in any form. I mean, literally, our geometry is founded on point, surface, and line that literally do not exist, or at least they would exist were we to understand them, but they don't. In our material reality, these things do not exist because they are perfect. And the reason why we cannot understand them is exactly that our material reality is flawed. Because we are the fallen ones who made it so. And here exactly the Apollonian prudence preserves from the vertigo of something that can't happen without having a cause and a purpose, right? That is only for itself, and according to the same movement with which it freed the will in a visual, let's say, in a view, now makes it appear through the categories of causality and of so-called sufficient reason, right? Profound affirmations in functional purposes of practical utility, of ideal and moral reasons that justify them, on which they rely. Right? Who can say whether what they're doing is absolutely right? Right? Which person can't be profitably criticized in some way? We can't do enough. Again, we cannot, at least we decided that we apparently cannot reach that infinite, and again, Nobody seems to have accomplished that so far because of our fallen status. So why everything that we have built on the base of this should stand on its feet? How can you claim that there is, for example, a causal connection between two things, right? If you can barely define, for example, what these things are. In many ways, it's wishful thinking. I mean, I tell it, as you know, as a historian that has to work in an incredible amount of uncertainty in the first place. The point is that the limitation in knowing that derives exactly from the fact that we decided to give it to subordinate ourselves to that kind of time and spatial dimension. That is to say, the reason why I don't know why a battle was fought the way it did is that I cannot dominate time and space, because otherwise I simply would go back in time and see it where it was. The answer, of course, is that battle and nothing human, at least in the fallen kind, would have happened historically if humanity had not lost its divine status, right? It's fully one. But the reason why we can trace some connection and why we can do more and grow more knowledgeable and, starting to dominate the entire world beyond these causal connections, and therefore starting to see also beyond them, and not being scared of it, is the proof that we're not in fact doomed yet, that we do have a divine spark that can help. And in case you didn't notice, in spite of our best scientific knowledge, we hardly ever use it. And I'm not saying in the sense that we're not making things work through scientific knowledge and that we need that strongly, but that what animates us has nothing to do with any scientific mechanism that we can, in fact, even reconstruct. Life is just a huge mystery. As much as our intuition is, as much as our knowledge, is there a physical work that explains to you what is knowledge, why we have it? At best, we know that some parts of the brain seem to be connected with the way we make it work, but what this thing is, including life and so all what you can imagine in this absolute sense, nobody has the palest idea of what the hell that is, at least in the conventional ways we use. And it turns out that instead, as humans, we understand each other without any need. How do you fall in love? Do you need a manual to fall in love? You don't, right? And the reason there is not that also something randomly clicks within you with the chemicals and all, because you actually decide that to happen. And you actually bring there a force that is like any other in the universe to happen, to generate. There are some beautiful sacred, ancient sacred saying about the eternal life, the absolute life, and how this is born through love and the Genesis. And this tells you something about how even a little grain that is like a seed in a man's heart can unleash a power that is infinite in the universe. So that's our divine spark. And we all kind of experience part of this every day, but hardly any of us is able to sublimate it, to make the real difference in that absolute sense. And believe me, all of this is connected. When we even speak, we are using a conventional code that we hardly can transmit through any true awareness of what we are, and in that sense, what the world really means to us. We are action and will are much more powerful than any of this. Albeit we are also limited in it. Also, thought can be expressed in these ways and motivate us. But we don't know exactly, or at least we know it, we experience it, but we can't fix exactly in any, in fact, of fallen approximation how this is really happening, right? Because that's the force that we're talking about that cannot be restricted or simply described or fixed somewhere, like in a description, and pretending that the same meaning of that empty vessel is the one of our actual life. Doesn't work like that. And this is the same reason why our concern with, for example, the rest of mankind and this effort to be understood seems also a process of the fall, right? The whole life of the great mass of men takes on the meaning of an escape from the center, as we were saying before. What is celebrated and hailed as diversity, for example, or any form of moral relativism, or saying, there is no difference. This is exclusively a desire to be numb and to ignore the fire that burns within us and that we cannot bear. You know what it means sometimes to feel that we are departing, right? That we are losing touch, that there is a purpose that is bigger than us, and that this manifests in a world that is not accustomed to see it, and that we are stopped by something that to us appears like, it's a reasonable choice, but that's really what reason is. Reason should support that greater purpose, and what we often call reason is just some form of cowardice and laziness, and in fact fear deep inside. We want something, but we're scared of it. We say, oh my God, this is what I truly feel, what I truly want, for a higher purpose that makes me palpitate. And yet others say, but then, what will you get? Is this in line with the rules? Is this, going to bring... And there is a pressure that we give way under by saying, well, yes, after all, because we're scared of the consequences, after all. We are scared of being hurt in a conventional sense. We're scared of doing lots of things. I was thinking about that. Last year it happened to me. And this is relatable because we all have moments like this in which we know that we weren't objectively doing something foolish. That is to say, we were not really risking, let's say, as we'll see now, in a Dionysian way, just for the pure attraction to hubris. On the contrary, we're actually risking for something that made all the possible sense in the world, and that simply we decided not to risk for, because we could maybe regret that. And had we failed, we may have actually realized why. But if we had succeeded, we would have rejoiced of that and extended our awareness over our existence in ways that are hard even to predict. And so succeeding, achieving, after a fight, after a struggle that always costs you something, is the greatest result that you can attain. Because once you're there, you realize that you have acquired much more of your confidence and much more of your will and much more of your capacity to take an ever greater step afterwards. Instead, cut off from our beings, we rather prefer to talk, to agitate, to seek, also in a way to mistake love, right, and to mate in some mutual request for confirmation, as if we wanted to say we are worth something, right? When we will die, this thing will have had a meaning, right? As if somebody but ourselves could even make any difference in answering us anything. So we multiply illusions, thus erect a great one pyramid of idols. It can be the constitution of society, of morality, of ideals, of metaphysical purposes, of the kingdom of the gods, or of a reassuring providence to make up for the inexistence of a central reason, of a fundamental meaning. Nietzsche uses these words as, if I'm not wrong, let's say that all the luminous spots to aid the injured eye for having stared into the horrible darkness. Right, we need to see, we need to distract ourselves. Just think how many times, if you are stressed out, if there is something that upsets you, you're anxious, you don't feel, you want to simply, you don't want to solve the problem because you accept that, say, I can't do anything about that. And so I will just distract myself until the thing happens, and you start watching some stupid TikTok video, right? Never watched TikTok ever in my life, but just to make an example. That happens all the time. This is what we are actually doing. We're not being distracted. We distract ourselves from the central point of existence. And you see, it's what I was saying in the beginning, also provocatively, in a dark sense. There is never an excuse for this. There's never an excuse for whatever happens to you. It doesn't matter if another person does it to you. You let it happen anyway, because you had the potential of not letting it happen. And we're talking even about the most simple things, really. That derives also from an incapacity, of course, because we're not trained to act concretely. And so, again, when things happen, we shouldn't even complain. Instead, we're told, or we are used to be told to each other, it's not your fault, you must be a victim. There is some other evil force that habituates you to think that you are under. And this is a real superstition. This is literally how others rightfully can control you at that point, because you have given up being the best self of yours. So the other, in the sense, the object, the cause, the reason, etc., is not existent in itself as it should be, and as it is, as a matter of fact. But it just becomes a symbolic apparition of the deficiency of the will to itself, with the act in which this asks another for its confirmation, in reality only confirming his own deficiency. And as I was saying before, Origenes, for example, talks about this. For example, the origin of the body. How and why was the body retained? Like, we have to think here at the dimension of perfection, which, of course, no material form was needed. Well, Origenes says that the body was created at the moment of the fall in order to prevent actually the further precipitate of souls, which is a beautiful thing, because in the Judeo-Christian tradition this happens naturally, because there is a God that still, after all, watches over us and provides for us But again, even in this tradition, there is always a question to which limit this is true. So our bodily dimension in this is quite interesting because it entails also a different type of evolutionary path. In fact, this is not inconsistent with evolution, but it can have brought to an involution of some sort, because if you accept that there is a truth and so a center and things are not random, every being fits in this hierarchy. And the idea is that, of course, the gods wouldn't leave any trace in a material world that fundamentally does not belong to the dimension. And thus this could even make us accept evolution in the other way around. That is to say that, humans are just, the elect race, and that all the other beings fundamentally emanated from and were more easily present, may have fallen all before us, as a matter of fact, in fact the simplest organisms, witness in that regard, and they would be, however, in fact, an involution of the same God, right? And in this sense, an emanation, in fact, that a product of that material product of that incarnation of the essences, and thus everything would fit in actually not in the sense that we evolved from them, but that they de-evolved from us, which can happen through evolution, how it works, right? Darwinism has been, of course, more recently debated also in true mainstream scientific terms, in the sense that we discovered that there are things that also start to make you feel a bit sorry for the poor Lamarck, because it turns out that albeit we hardly have a control on these things, there is a way to transmit some genetic characteristics through behavior, right, in ways that are very complex. And so not just, in fact, like the example that they told you for Lamarck, that the son of a boxer is going to be beefier because his father just spent his life in the gym. Not in that regard, but possibly connected in a sense. So it's obvious that the smaller, like, also the less pulsating, right, and the more the closest to the inert, to the rigid, to the foreign, right? So the objective world is, of course, our paralyzed great body that, however, is devoid of life, frozen or fixed by the limit condition through fear. And us beings have an ever greater power to dominate us, because we have within us life that should be able to take over this great material world, and so to be as big as it from a spiritual point of view.